You can see why Hooker thinks he is holding all the cards. He's got a great position. He's controlling the roads. He's got everything all lined up in front of him. Things look fantastic.
And the rolling terrain is going to play into how the battle takes shape.
They're going to outflank the Union Army greatly, using this road as what we would call their axis of advance, or the line of advance.
This is probably going to be the most controversial order that Joseph Hooker ever issues in his entire military career.
He really is feeling aggressive. He wants to go after Jackson, and he's eventually going to get permission to start harassing Jackson's column.
There are 17,000 casualties, and that's one man every second over those 5 hours that will fall as a casualty.
Everything along the northern edge of that blue patch is now housing development. So had this not been preserved, you can imagine this whole battlefield would have disappeared underneath houses.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We'll discuss those stories and much, much more here on our Chancellorsville virtual tour. Welcome, everybody. My name is Chris White, and I'm the Education Manager for the American Battlefield Trust. And I'm happy to be joined today by Dan Davis. Dan is also with the American Battlefield Trust. And we're joined by Chris Mackowski of Emerging Civil War, as well as St. Bonaventure University. And today, the three of us are going to take you around virtually the battlefield at Chancellorsville. And we're going to focus on two of the crucial engagements during the Chancellorsville campaign, which took place during April and May of 1863. The idea to do this virtually is going to be based on some of the assets that the American Battlefield Trust has on our website. That would be battlefields.org. We'll take you through some of our virtual tours, show off some of our maps, galleries, and other assets that we have, all for free over at battlefields.org. So we hope that you will take advantage of all these great resources that we put together. And once you get the opportunity, we hope that you head out to the Chancellorsville battlefield to really take in the entire battlefield itself. But the two places we're going to take you today are the first day's action at Chancellorsville, which is crucial to opening the battle at Chancellorsville, and it's also crucial to the preservation efforts down there on the battlefield at Chancellorsville in Northern Virginia. The first day's battlefield was saved by the American Battlefield Trust more than a decade ago now, and it's a key component to telling the overall story of the Chancellorsville campaign. And then we'll follow the most famous action at Chancellorsville, and that will be Stonewall Jackson's famed flank attack, which took place on May 2nd of 1863. It will be a 12-mile, very circuitous march that will carry the Confederates onto the right flank of the Union forces and initiate the Confederate offensive, which will really carry them from Chancellorsville north across the Potomac River for the second time and to Gettysburg, where they will finally give up that initiative on July 3rd of 1863 with that famous attack at Gettysburg called Pickett's Charge. So today what we're going to do is walk you through a little bit about the Battle of Chancellorsville. We'll give you a nice overview of what the campaign would look like in 1863, why this campaign is going to be prosecuted by the Federals, how close the Federals came to victory, and how the Confederates themselves actually will turn the tide here in Chancellorsville that will give them that initiative that I just talked about and to carry them north towards Gettysburg. So as we begin our exploration of Chancellorsville, and I'm going to go to one of our screen shares and show you the American Battlefield Trust homepage. This is battlefields.org. What we'll be walking you through will be some of our virtual tours. Our virtual tours will take place under our visit section here on the battlefield. All you need to do is go down to virtual tours, click there. I'm not going to do so because I already have our tab open. And just to give you an idea of what the Chancellorsville battlefield would look like in 1863 and today, these are our great assets that we'll walk you through one of our virtual tours. We have embedded pictures, we have text, we have all kinds of things we'll show you here over the next half hour or so as we walk you through the Chancellorsville campaign, or at least a portion of it. So to get to Chancellorsville, we actually need to jump over to another asset from our partners in Emerging Civil War, and that would be some of the maps that they've created for their Emerging Civil War book series. So to give you an idea of where we stand in 1863, we'll take you to April of 1863. The American Civil War itself has entered its third summer, or it's about to enter its third summer, I should say, and the Union war effort in the Eastern Theater had not done well in the winter and fall of 1862. The Union Army will encamp after the Battle of Fredericksburg, north of the city of Fredericksburg up in Stafford County, Virginia. This is what the Army of the Potomac, the Union Army, will call its Valley Forge winter. Very low morale. Supplies had not been very good. Their commander, Ambrose Burnside, was not well received by many of the men after the debacle in December at Fredericksburg. So Abraham Lincoln, the president of the United States at this point, will replace in January of 1863 Ambrose Burnside with Joseph Hooker. And I'll show you a picture of Joe Hooker here in a little while. But Joe Hooker, 48 years old, a Hadley, Massachusetts native and a West Point graduate of the class of 1838, will take over this army at its low point, that Valley Forge period. And Joe Hooker is very much a braggart. He's a guy who has a lot of confidence in himself, which is actually something that the Army of the Potomac needed. Somebody who is going to help to bolster their morale and bolster their fighting spirit. And Joe Hooker does that. He's going to rally them in many different ways, including improving the supply system, breaking them into their old Army Corps system, giving them Corps badges, identification badges, which will help raise their esprit de corps. And then eventually he will carry the war to the enemy. So Joe Hooker, with about 130,000 men sitting north of Fredericksburg, will come up with a battle plan. South of the Rappahannock River and stretched for, all along the Rapidan River here, all the way down towards Richmond and Ashland area, you'll have the Confederate Army spread out on a wide area because their supply system is going to be taxed throughout the winter of 1862-63. There's only about 60,000 Confederates in this area, about half the number of the Union soldiers that are in this area. And Robert E. Lee, because of this, the Confederate commander, will have to wait for the Union Army to make the first move during this spring offensive of 1863. What's that spring offensive going to look like? Simply put, Joe Hooker will come up with a plan, and his plan will be very simple. He is going to break his army into three wings. One wing, a right wing with three Union infantry corps, the 5th, the 11th, and the 12th, will march their way around the Confederate left flank, utilize a number of different fords, Kelly's Ford, Germanna Ford, and come in behind Robert E. Lee's forces, which are largely massed around the city of Fredericksburg. At the same time, Hooker will send a left wing just south of Fredericksburg. These 60,000 or so men will be charged with holding Lee's attention towards Fredericksburg, while Hooker's main force moves in from the west and the north. The idea will be to try to crush Lee between these two wings of the army or force him to fall back south on this map towards Richmond. The third and final component of this advance will be George Stoneman's cavalry. You'll see them on a dotted line here. These will be the Union horsemen who will make a deep raid, penetrating raid south towards the Virginia Central Rail line and towards Richmond. Their goal is to disrupt Confederate communications and supplies and the supply system, as well as hopefully hinder Lee as he falls back towards Richmond, and Hooker can bring his entire force to bear. Now, by late April of 1863, Hooker has his men starting to amass around the crossroads of Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville is not a town. If it had a train, which it did not, we would call this a whistle stop because it's only one large mansion and a few outbuildings and a few scattered houses in what's known as the wilderness of Spotsylvania and Orange counties of Virginia. 70 square miles of dense second and growth forest, which make it nearly impenetrable for armies. But the road system will carry Hooker's army here, where he does not intend to fight a battle. Robert E. Lee, though, ever the aggressor, finds that left wing below Fredericksburg is nothing more than a feint. He will leave a holding force of about 10,000 to 12,000 Confederates around Fredericksburg and then start to march his main army towards the west, towards Chancellorsville, where he will meet Joe Hooker head on as he's trying to make a three-pronged approach towards Fredericksburg down three different roads: the River Road, the Orange Turnpike, and the Orange Plank Road. Three separate roads making this advance towards Lee's rear. Lee, though, Ever the aggressor, as I said, turned to strike Joseph Hooker, who thought Lee would have to ingloriously fly or come out of his trenches to do battle with him. And that's exactly what Lee will do. He will not ingloriously fly, but he will come out of his entrenchments at Fredericksburg and attack Joseph Hooker's forces around what we call today the first day's battlefield. And what I'm going to do is kick it over to Dan Davis. Dan is our education associate at the American Battlefield Trust. Dan has been integral in putting together these virtual tours, which I'm going to bring up for you right now. This is our first day at Chancellorsville Battlefield. Dan, why don't you take us through the first day here as I bring up the screen for you and start to talk about the Battle of Chancellorsville and that key piece of ground that the American Battlefield Trust purchased not so long ago.
Thanks, Chris. On the morning of May 1st, 157 years ago today, Joseph Hooker advances east from Chancellorsville toward Lee's rear at Fredericksburg. As Chris mentioned, it's a three-pronged advance. George Meade's 5th Corps advances along the River Road. George Sykes' division from Meade's 5th Corps, Division of U.S. Regulars, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes, advance along the Orange Turnpike, or as we know it today, modern Virginia Route 3. And Henry Slocum's 12th Corps advances along the Orange Plank Road. It's Hooker's intent that these three columns converge on Lee's rear at Fredericksburg, but as Hooker's going to quickly find out, Lee, in fact, is not sitting at Fredericksburg. He's marching straight toward the Federal Army himself. He's moving west. And as George Sykes' division of regulars advances west along the Orange Turnpike, they actually clear the wilderness, that dense secondary force that Chris mentioned a few minutes ago, and they engage elements from Little Billy Mahone's Virginia Brigade. Now, talking just a little bit about the U.S. regulars, armies during the Civil War were made up primarily from volunteers, regiments raised by the states. The U.S. regulars are the professional soldiers. There are U.S. regular units in both the Eastern and Western Theater, commanded by that fellow there on the screen. In this particular instance, George Sykes. These are the professional soldiers. The professional soldiers. The regiments in Sykes's division are made up of some of the oldest serving regiments in the U.S. Army. In fact, the 17th United States Infantry is going to deploy as skirmishers and advance leading Colonel Sidney Burbank's brigade out of the wilderness. They're going to encounter, as I mentioned just a moment ago, Mahone's Virginians, and they're going to start to push Mahone back across the open fields that you see on the screen. But as the regulars are deploying onto the field, so too is the rest of Mahone's brigade, followed by Richard Anderson's Confederate division. Sykes is going to bring up the rest of Burbank's brigade, and there's going to be a seesaw fight that takes place across those open fields. But Sykes is going to get himself into a little bit of trouble. He's going to look off to his right, where you can see on the map the 2nd and the 6th U.S. Infantry is deployed. There's nothing but woods, very dense, heavy terrain to the south of the turnpike, and those two regiments are eventually going to run into elements from Robert Rhodes's division from Stonewall Jackson's corps advancing out along the Orange Plank Road. To his left, to the north, the area is also rather densely wooded. But Sykes is also going to find that is going to carry him away from the left flank of his own line. Meade is pushing farther to the north toward the Rappahannock River. Sykes is going to find that his left flank is undefended. And at the same time, Sykes is going to receive a message coming from Hooker back at Chancellorsville to disengage with the Confederates and then to begin to withdraw back toward the Chancellorsville crossroads and there take up a defensive position. This is probably going to be the most controversial order that Joseph Hooker ever issues in his entire military career. Up until this point in time, Lee has had to react to what Hooker has done with his massive turning movement, the flanking movement that he launched just several days earlier. Now with Lee coming out from his entrenchments at Fredericksburg, it's going to take Hooker by surprise, and he's going to give up the initiative to Robert E. Lee. This is very, very important. This is going to change the entire course of the battle at Chancellorsville. No longer will Lee be reacting to what Hooker does, but Hooker's going to have to react to what Lee does. In fact, Henry Slocum is so upset about receiving this order while he's advancing along the Orange Plank Road, he's actually making headway. He's pushing back Jackson's corps. Slocum threatens to shoot the courier who brings him the word to disengage and pull back to Chancellorsville. The regulars are going to conduct an orderly withdrawal. They're going to be covered by Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps Division and the regulars are going to pull back toward the Chancellorsville crossroads. But also at the same time, Hooker's going to give up some high ground around the crossroads. In fact, high ground that you can visit today there along the Catherine Furnace Road or modern McLaws' Drive. And he's going to pull back to lower ground around the Chancellorsville crossroads, giving up the high ground to the Confederates. And George Meade, as he is forced to pull back from his advance, is going to be heard to say that how can we expect to hold the top of the hill if we cannot hold the bottom of it? So as Lee is coming onto the field, Jackson is coming onto the field. The hours are starting to play out on May 1st. It's growing on toward late afternoon, early in the evening, and Lee and Jackson are going to have a very big decision to make that evening as far as what to do next with the Army as they've met Hooker that day at Chancellorsville.
Yeah, and Chris, I want to bring you in here for a moment to talk. This is really Jackson's first flank attack at Chancellorsville, as some people put it. What you're seeing here is the Orange Turnpike, which is modern-day Route 3 that runs down from Chancellorsville, which is just about 1.5 miles to the west or off to the left of this map. Fredericksburg's about 10 miles to the right of this map. To the east, you have the Confederates advancing down, as Dan said, from the Zoan Church Ridge area. This is today still the Zoan Church, modern structure there today. There's also some earthworks that you can visit, but mostly that area has been developed. The Confederates are moving also down the Orange Plank Road, which is down at the bottom of the map here where I'm circling, down by Alfred Iverson and Colquitt's brigades. The Orange Plank Road and the Orange Turnpike will actually converge together at a few different points as it goes closer towards Fredericksburg. So you have the Union 12th Army Corps under Henry Slocum, as Dan mentioned, on the Orange Plank Road. You have the Union 5th and 2nd Corps, elements of it, moving down this road here, the Turnpike in the middle, and off to the north to the top of this map is a road called the River Road, modern-day Route 610, and that is carrying 2/3 of the Union 5th Army Corps towards United States Ford. One of the key factors in this battle is that you're going to have two rivers to contend with, the Rapidan and Rappahannock River, as well as a bunch of other fords that would be along these rivers. There's many fordable points. Dan also mentioned Henry Slocum being very upset. He's actually going to be so upset about having to pull back and give up the initiative that he will arrest the officer who comes up to tell him to turn back for treason. And that person is Washington Roebling, the man who is the future brother-in-law of Gouverneur Kimball Warren, future 5th Corps commander, and he's also the man who helped to build the Brooklyn Bridge in New York. So, Chris, I know you live very close to this map. Anything you want to add here before we talk a little bit about preservation, about Jackson's first flank attack here?
That's right. I actually live on the Orange Plank Road just off the bottom edge of this map. So as I'm sitting, I'm basically just off the map looking at essentially out my front yard where Confederates had advanced and there had been Confederate artillery. What I think is remarkable about this map in particular, and as well as the 360 view we were looking at a few moments ago. The first day was often overlooked in favor of the larger Lee flank attack movement that we'll be talking about in just a few moments. And so this portion of the battlefield often underestimated, often under-discussed, and it was really the preservation of this property that allowed that story to open up and get told. Some 700 casualties are going to litter the ground on this first day's battlefield, so it's literally hollowed ground. And if you look at that blue patch that the American Battlefield Trust preserved, everything along the northern edge of that blue patch is now housing development. So had this not been preserved, you can imagine this whole battlefield would have disappeared underneath houses. So this preservation effort cannot be overstressed for its importance, because it really did help preserve this vital part of the story. If you walk out onto that property, there are about 4 miles of trails. You can just see some wonderful vistas, as we saw a little bit in that 360 view a few moments ago. But if you stand on the high ground that the Federals occupied on the west side of Lick Run. It is a tremendously formidable position. You get a great view of the battlefield. I always think of Malvern Hill, where the Federals were stationed along a good high ridge, and the Confederates had a lot of open ground across to get up there. And it's only because the Federals were flanked on the southern end that they were forced to pull out and evacuate what was a topographically superior position to hold. So you can see here, looking at the 360, we're looking off in the direction now as the Federals fell back. They would have been on that far hillside and kind of right in the center of the screen. It's a great spot to perch, and you could repulse attacks from that spot all day. But of course, as I mentioned a second ago, they lost their flank, and so, as Dan said earlier, had to pull back toward the safety of the Chancellorsville intersection, hunker down onto a defensive position. I love these 360 views, so I really encourage folks to take time after they watch us to go onto the website and explore these at your leisure, because the experiences are so rich, the views are so fantastic.
Yeah, and what Chris is discussing here, you know, the far ridge line that you're seeing, and please go over to battlefields.org, check out these virtual tours. You're looking up at McGee Ridge. That's the McGee family lived up here. You'd be looking at Reuben McGee's house in this area, this vicinity. No longer there, but part of the foundation. It was part of an existing home out there at one point. The housing plan that Chris alluded to is just over top of this knoll. Years ago, now over a decade ago, volunteers came out and started to plant tree buffers to help to buffer the tree line and to kind of protect it from that view shed. The area south of the road, where you're looking in this direction, you can see some development off to the left-hand side. I always gauged how much the development, or how well the development was doing. Whenever I lived on the Chancellorsville battlefield, I was one of 5 people and a dog who lived at Chancellorsville at one point. And the sign was for a housing plan that would say starting in the low 500s. By the time it reached its peak, the houses were starting in the low 800s, and then the bubble burst and it dropped down to the low 400s. But this whole area was preserved by the American Battlefield Trust. It wasn't that name at the time. We've gone through some name changes since, but the Toll brothers were integral in helping us, a local developer actually. We work closely with developers. We're not anti-development at the American Battlefield Trust, and this development firm helped us to secure this piece of the land so that we could protect it in perpetuity, and that is one of the great successes down here at Chancellorsville. There were bypasses talked about out here. There were developments, and in the long run, in a long drawn-out fight, which is outlined in our Fighting the Second Civil War book that explains the battlefield preservation movement of the American Battlefield Trust, you can read all about just how hard of a fight this was. And in the end, it really helped us to at least get this piece of battlefield land. And we have a great trail out here today. Now, Dan, the one thing we didn't talk about at all as I'm scrolling back and forth is that there are a lack of horsemen on both sides. Where are the Union Cav right now?
There is some Union cavalry on the first day at Chancellorsville. In fact, the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry opens the battle with elements from Mahone's brigade, and they fight delaying action back across these fields, starting from the far distance of this photograph, and then pulling all the way back to Lick Run, where they're finally reinforced by Sidney Burbank's brigade of the U.S. Regulars. 17th U.S. Infantry takes up their spot on the skirmish line, and the battle it becomes a seesaw battle. But the bulk of the Union cavalry is far off to the south. George Stoneman's newly created cavalry corps is in the midst of breaking up Lee's supply lines running back to Richmond. It's Hooker's idea that Stoneman is going to produce so much havoc in Lee's rear that Lee's going to have no other option but to withdraw from Fredericksburg to defend his lines of supply and communication going back toward his capital at Richmond. And then Hooker, in fact, believes that Stoneman will be the anvil, while Hooker and the infantry will be the hammer from which to defeat Lee's army somewhere north of Richmond. But as we just talked about, Lee does not withdraw from Fredericksburg. He has Hooker in his sights, and he's coming for Joseph Hooker.
Yeah, that's a perfect point. And I think the problem you run out here in 1863 and then later in 1864 when the battle takes place is that the Union especially do not properly use their horsemen in either one of the campaigns. They send them essentially on fool's errands, which really blind them more and more throughout the 63 campaign of Chancellorsville and then the early to mid stages of the Overland Campaign of 1864, which will take place right over some of the same land here at Chancellorsville. So, Chris, I'm going to send it over to you. So Robert E. Lee has pushed Hooker back. He now has a new defensive line around the Chancellorsville crossroads. I'll bring up some other assets to show some folks here. But what are we starting to look at on the evening of May 1st into the morning of May the 2nd?
Joe Hooker feels like he has all the cards at this point. He's pulled back into a tight circle around the Chancellorsville intersection. He feels that he's controlling the main intersection, so his lines of supply, reinforcement, communication, and if necessary, retreat, all protected. He has chosen the ground. He knows that being in the middle of Virginia, Robert E. Lee's got to come at him, so he feels like he's holding all these cards. But the one card that he has surrendered that we've talked about so much here is the initiative, and that, of course, is always the card that Robert E. Lee is looking to play. So he's going to get together with his top lieutenant, Stonewall Jackson, and they're going to figure out how they can seize the initiative that Hooker has surrendered. What we're looking at here is the park map of the tour, and if we kind of focus our attention to spot number 5 on this map, that's the Lee Jackson bivouac site. On the evening of May 1st, the two commanders get there, start talking, trying to figure out what they're going to do next. They happen to be meeting right in the middle of an intersection, and federal sharpshooters start taking pot shots at them, so they kind of go off to the side of the road to an area now that is monumented, and there they're going to spread out their maps and try to figure out just what this federal position looks like. Jeb Stuart, the Confederate cavalry commander, is going to come in with additional reconnaissance, and what he's going to discover is that the federal right flank is basically hanging up in the air. Remember, Chris talked about the Federal Army being so large that it's going to use a whole bunch of different fords to get to the site. And so some of the Union Army is still coming onto the battlefield, the 3rd and the 11th Corps, bringing up the rear from the Germanna Ford. And so that rear of the Army is unprotected. We talk about it being the flank because Jackson's movement sort of turns it into that. But that's really the rear of the Union Army. And Jeb Stuart says, this place is vulnerable. Lee and Jackson confirm, realize they've got to get out there. They've got to attack because that's the most vulnerable spot on the entire federal configuration. And so they need to try to figure out exactly how to get there. Stuart goes off to do some additional reconnaissance, comes back with a guy named Charles Welford, who owns the local furnace. And if we kind of juggle back to the park map in just a second, or maybe I guess we'll head down to the furnace with another one of our 360 views in a second. Charles Welford owns the Catherine furnace, and he's going to say, look, there are some roads here that don't show up on your maps. I know about them. I cut them myself to get to firewood to my furnace. And so he's going to offer his own son, Charles Jr., as a guide to lead Jackson's troops around to the flank. As Lee and Jackson continue to talk about this, they're trying to figure out, how many men should Jackson take with him? How many men should Lee have? Lee's going to stick with the First Corps commanders, First Corps divisions of Anderson and McLaws. We haven't really mentioned this, but the rest of the First Corps is down in the southeastern part of the state under James Longstreet on a foraging mission. So basically, Lee is going to have to act as not only an Army commander, but as a Corps commander for half of the First Corps. And he's going to stay in position. We can see on this map here, Chris is going to circle that area where Robert E. Lee is going to stay with McLaws and Anderson's divisions, and they're basically going to act as a diversion to hold Hooker's attention. Then Stonewall Jackson is going to start marching down toward Catherine Furnace on these roads that Charles Welford has cut, and it's going to let him circumnavigate way out of range of the Union Army and then slip around up into their rear. And he's going to be able to make such a maneuver because he goes so far south before hooking back around. That's going to take him out of the view of federal spotters, and he's going to start lining up. He's going to head out shortly about 7:30 in the morning on May 2nd to make this march. It's going to take him all day. The jig is going to be up as he starts marching, and Federals are going to spot him. They are going to harass his column as it moves, starting to open up with artillery. And 3rd Corps commander of the Federal Army, Devil Dan Dan Sickles, one of the most colorful folks in the whole army, he really is feeling aggressive. He wants to go after Jackson, and he's eventually going to get permission to start harassing Jackson's column. But for the most part, Joe Hooker is going to misread all the signals that he's getting about this maneuver and convince himself that Jackson is retreating, that the entire Confederate army is pulling away, and all the action to the east, that's Robert E. Lee acting as a diversion, he thinks that's the rear guard. And so he decides he's going to squash them and then turn and go after the column as it's on the march. So by misinterpreting what's going on, Hooker is not going to respond or prepare well, and that's going to allow Jackson to get around him. Mentioned a few minutes ago the 360 view that we have down at Catherine Furnace, another of the great assets that the American Battlefield Trust has at battlefields.org. This is Catherine Furnace. It had been built to just produce the iron ore and process it. That's rich in this area. It's why the ground around this area is so red. You can see what the furnace complex looked like once upon a time. Today, only the ruins of the original stack remain. This was an iron producing facility for the Confederate Army at the time, and so it was important for the war effort. And Jackson's men are going to kind of march down into this area and then head off into the woods. But Dan Sickles, as I mentioned, is going to start to send some troops down in this area to harass them. So Jackson's basically going to just peel off the lead unit in his column, the 23rd Georgia, and they're going to act as a screen, which allows the rest of Jackson's column to slip on by. The 23rd Georgia is going to have a fearsome fight because they're going to be well overwhelmed by the Federal forces that come down to meet them, and they will begrudgingly give up ground as they fall back, allowing Jackson to slip away. Berdan's sharpshooters, you see there, one of the more famous units in the Union Army, leading the charge there. Eventually, the 23rd is going to fall all the way back to an unfinished railroad line, make a final stand there. Their colonel, Emory Best, will give the order to retreat, turn around, and run. Nobody else hears him, and so most of the 23rd Georgia will actually be captured as a result of fierce rear guard action that they serve. Emory Best will get court-martialed as a result of that. You can follow the Jackson Trail today, head down to Catherine Furnace, and then take a left down the old dirt road, and you can follow all of Jackson's flank march. It's a fantastic route to take if you're really looking for it. You can see the dirt road there in the background. So as Jackson slips away and starts to get into position, Hooker is feeling confident that he's got Lee well under control, completely ignorant of the threat that is looming in his rear. Federals along the line hear reports of the movement. They get skittish. They ask if they can sort of investigate whether they should hunker down into some sort of defense. Hooker assures them, no, we're going to be fine. In fact, cook up 3 days worth of rations because we're going after those Confederates tomorrow. So as a result, the Federals are really going to be unprepared for what Jackson is getting ready to deliver. There's old Chuck Welford right there taking a look and saying hello to us.
Thanks, Chris. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Jackson's flank attack here in a few minutes. This road that you're looking at on our virtual tour here right now, to the right, you'll see the old Welford House, which no longer stands. Most of the homes on the battlefields at Fredericksburg no longer stand for a variety of reasons. Many of them will be victims of fire in the late 19th and early 20th century, including the Chancellor Mansion itself, which will burn twice, once during the American Civil War and then just after the turn of the 20th century into the 1920s. So this area, a lot of the homes are not there, but a lot of the road cuts are still here. You can drive down this road, as Chris pointed out. This is known as Jackson's Trail East and West, and you would be following in the footsteps of Stonewall Jackson's foot cavalry as they're moving their way towards the Union right flank. This area, as Chris mentioned, had the iron furnace. This area was very rich in iron and gold ore. In fact, some of the first settlers in this area will come to Spotsylvania County, named after Lieutenant Governor Alexander Spots Woods. Spotsylvania simply is his name, Spots Woods. Sylvania means woods, just like Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods. So there's a lot of woods here, virgin forest, whenever they first arrive here in the early to mid 1700s. Then they find the iron ore at places like Germana, which is a settlement that you can go visit on the Wilderness Battlefield today, about 12 miles from where this picture was taken. And they will go in, they'll find the ore, they'll clear cut vast portions of the forest to create the charcoal that they need to fuel the furnaces, and they'll have blasts throughout the year. And this the pig iron produced at the Catherine Iron Furnace will be shipped during the American Civil War to Richmond, down to the Tredegar Iron Works. Now, Richmond, or Virginia, I should say, is the largest gold producing state up until the 1848-49 gold rush. So you also have gold in the area. If you go north of Fredericksburg, there's a little place called Gold Vein. It's simply on a vein of gold. And you can visit the gold museum there at Gold Vein. So there's a lot of different history in this area to talk about. What you're not seeing out in this area will be large, vast plantations. Most of the people living in this area were living in heavy woods. These are subsistence farmers. They're hand to mouth most of the time. They would take what goods that they would have east to Fredericksburg, to the port, or traveling through the Piedmont, they could take it out to Orange Courthouse. But the two roads coming through this area, the Orange Plank Road and the Orange Turnpike, are both known as improved roads. And these roads, the idea would be to get goods from the Piedmonts to the port and vice versa. So that is what's going to give the rise in 1816 to Chancellorsville, which is simply a mansion we'll show you a little bit later, which acted as what we would consider a bed and breakfast today. It would also have a farrier there, a post office. This was a place where you could stop, have your horse reshod, mail a letter, spend the evening, move on your way to Fredericksburg, 12 miles to the east, or head out to Orange and Culpeper, 25 and 30 miles out to the west. So this area really is an area that most people would pass through, and that's what Hooker thought he was going to do. Hooker now is perceiving what Jackson and Lee are up to. What happens is Hooker is going to make a bold assumption, and that would be that Stonewall Jackson is going to head his column not to the west like you were seeing here on our maps, but he is actually going to, as I bring up our screen share, he is actually going to keep going to the south, toward the southwest. His idea, what Hooker thinks, is that Lee and Jackson are pulling off towards Gordonsville, which is about 26 miles away. It's a key rail center. It's also in the future the fried chicken capital of the world, allegedly. But Gordonsville is going to be crucial because that is where Lee can get supplies, he can get reinforcements, and it's open fields rather than the area around Chancellorsville. So Hooker, rightfully so, thinks Lee, outnumbered more than 2-1, is pulling off of this battlefield. He is going to start to send troops from his flank attack area, which we'll have Dan talk about here in a few minutes, from this area on his right flank down to the Catherine Iron Furnace. He'll send a brigade from there. He'll also send the entire 3rd Army Corps eventually down to this area, down around the Catherine Iron Furnace, which creates a gap in the Union lines roughly from here to here, and the Union line, which will run off in that direction, because I love this pen. This is what it would look like. You would have a massive hole in Hooker's lines right in the center between his smallest corps, the 11th, who are out at tour stop number 8, about 11,000 men strong. Easy to remember, 11th Corps, about 11,000 men. About 1,200 of those men will be sent down to the Iron Furnace, and then you have the 3rd Corps come down to here. So not only has Hooker misread or misinterpreted what Lee is up to, he's created a gap in the center of his lines, weakened the attack point where the Confederates will be striking, and he is also going to think that and start to cut orders for his men the next day to start marching off in this direction in the footsteps of Jackson's men to hit the Confederates somewhere else. 60 rounds of ammunition are given out. 3 days rations are issued, as Chris said, and Hooker is ready to take the fight back to the enemy on May the 3rd. But that is not at all what is going to happen. So Dan, let me jump over to our virtual tour. We're going to skip over one slide here, and that'll take us past Poplar Run. I'll show it to you very quickly. You're not missing too much as you go along Poplar Run. In this picture, it looks more like a puddle, but Poplar Run itself is going to be a key feature as Jackson's men march across it during the May 2nd flank attack. Today, you'll drive through this water. There's a spillway there, so you won't get flooded out, so don't worry. But eventually, Stonewall Jackson will arrive on the Union right flank out into this very bucolic setting today on the National Park Service land. Dan, why don't you take us in Jackson's footsteps out here to the Union right flank?
Well, what's interesting, as Chris just mentioned, is that as far as Jackson's concerned, the morning of May the 2nd and through the course of the day, he's going to be attacking the Union right flank, but because of the dispositions made by Hooker during the day to responding to Jackson's march to the Catherine Furnace, the right flank has now essentially become the rear of the Union Army. Just Jackson doesn't know it. The new Union line stretches from the Rappahannock southward to and roughly ends in the area around Catherine Furnace. But what's going to play into Jackson's favor is that the 11th Corps stretches along the Orange Turnpike, again, modern Route 3. And as Chris mentioned earlier, the only reserves that were in the 11th Corps line, they're now at Catherine Furnace. So the 11th Corps, the rear of Hooker's army, is ripe for the picking. Jackson's going to reach the Orange Turnpike roughly about a mile, 2 miles in the distance from where this photograph was taken. And he's going to begin deploying toward the early to middle afternoon hours of May the 2nd. Jackson does not have time on his side. He's not going to be able to put his entire 30,000-man corps into the fight because he knows that at any moment Hooker could turn on him or could turn on Lee and defeat the Confederate Army in detail, since the Confederate Army is divided. So Jackson comes up with a very simple plan. The 1st Division on the march, Robert Rhodes's division, they're going to go in first. They're going to initiate the attack. If Rhodes in any event meets stiff resistance, he's going to send for word back to Raleigh Colston in Colston's division, the next division in line of the march, to come up and support the Confederate line. Around 5:15 or so, Jackson is ready to go forward. He gives the simple order, you can go forward then. About 5:15, skirmishers step off, and roughly at about 5:30, the fighting's going to begin. Now, you're going to have to put yourself in the shoes of the men of the 11th Corps. They've been told to stand down, stand on their arms, cook rations, prepare to pursue the Confederate Army in the morning. They're not expecting any type of battle whatsoever. It's supper time. In fact, there are accounts that there are men slaughtering beeves or cattle that had come along on the march with the flanking or with Hooker's flanking column in preparation for the evening meal. But all of a sudden, much to their surprise, from the woods to their right and to their front, out come a stampede of wildlife. Deer, foxes, skunks, raccoons, you name it. And one Union soldier said he remembered seeing a black bear come running out of the woods. And behind that stampede of wildlife is Jackson's skirmish line, followed by the main battle line. They fire a volley, and for the next 2 hours, there's going to be utter and sheer pandemonium throughout the 11th Corps as Jackson's corps rolls forward. And as you can see from the 360 that this terrain that they're going to be advancing across here it's very open. It's very rolling. And the rolling terrain is going to play into how the battle takes shape. Jackson is going to strike the Union line, which is at this point in time in the distance where you see the white buildings facing to the south. We're at a vantage point roughly north of or behind the Union line. There are Confederates that are advancing through these ravines and through these swales that you see here that actually don't run into any Union resistance because the line is off to their far right. Again, it's below and along the Orange Turnpike. So those units, as they're advancing forward, are going to begin to start to drift off to their right because the Union line is they're not encountering any type of Union resistance in their immediate front. And as the battle takes shape and goes along, that Confederate line is going to become disjointed with units running into one another along the Orange Turnpike, which is eventually going to force Jackson to call a halt to his advance later on in the evening. But as Jackson's line rolls forward, they're going to roll up the divisions of the 11th Corps. The 11th Corps is commanded by Oliver Otis Howard. He lost an arm at Fair Oaks. This is his first battle as a corps commander, and he does not perform very well. He has not heeded the words of his pickets and his sentries, and there's a picture of Oliver Howard up on the screen for you. He's not heeded the warnings of his pickets and his skirmishers that there's a Confederate force moving around his front. There's Confederates concentrating to his right, but much to Howard's credit, he is going to attempt to rally his men during the fight. There's a very famous photograph, and Chris just pulled it up there. Howard's attempting to rally his troops to face Jackson's onslaught. Some men will form again or form up in what is known as the Bushback line, named after one of the one of the officers in the 11th Corps, Adolphus Bushback. But for the most part, there's not going to be very much resistance given to Jackson's advance as he pushes westward, or excuse me, pushes from the west toward the east into Hooker's position.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that people need to keep in mind is that the Confederates are very successful out here. The 11th Corps will sustain about 2,400 casualties. Many of them are captured. The 11th Corps does try to stand and fight. There are only a handful of regiments facing out to the west, including the 153rd Pennsylvania, who are a 9-month regiment. This is their first actual engagement. They're going to be swept off the field. They'll go to Gettysburg. They'll hold the right flank of the Union line on the first day at Gettysburg. They're going to get swept off the field there. If I'm with the 153rd, I'm asking for my money back from this war, because it's ridiculous. They're always put in the worst place at the worst possible moments. But as Dan mentioned, this is the area of the Bushbeck line. This area is near the Wilderness Church, as you'll see here today. This is the third or fourth structure of the Wilderness Church that stood there on this area. The foundation is essentially the same footprint from 1863, but this is a modern building. There are trenches that run into this area because some of the Union forces, even though they are facing to the south, which is this direction towards this house that you see across the street, you're looking at the modern 4-lane modern day Route 3. This is Virginia 3. If you go to your right, that'll take you out towards Orange Courthouse and Culpeper. If you go to your left, it'll take you to Chancellorsville, about a mile and a half from where this picture was taken, and then another 12 miles down the road will take you to Fredericksburg, Virginia, the major city of about 5,000 people in 1863 in this area. But most of the Union forces are aligned along this road. Some of them are facing out to the west, and that's why we have this Bushbeck line photograph here. Adolphus Bushbeck, who is the commander of the 29th New York, rises to brigade command, will decide that he wants to try to put a line facing to the west. Eventually, about 5,000 Union soldiers will fall into this Bushbeck line. It's a mixed bag of units, but Jackson will quickly rally his men and push forward past this Bushbeck line, which holds for probably about 30 minutes. Now, Jackson, as Dan pointed out, had some problems. First off, some of the Confederates are not engaging with Union soldiers. One, the Jackson's line far extends off to the Union right flank, off into those woods that you see there. It extends to the left on this picture to the south. So they're going to outflank the Union Army greatly, using this road as what we would call their axis of advance, or the line of advance, where they're going to follow this along, just like following a modern road. And the Confederates themselves, as they go forward, will also run into the problem that many of the Union forces aren't standing and fighting. They're running away. So this will break up unit cohesion for the Confederates. They'll have to run out, tackle men to capture prisoners. They'll have to deal with prisoners of war. Many of the Union soldiers, as Dan mentioned, were cooking their meals, and they are going to stop these Confederates. They will grab pots, pans, eat, shout, fire, and rush on, as one Confederate would state later on. So what you're seeing here is those unit cohesion breaking up. Then the third and final factor is the terrain. To the north and the south, you have the heavy woods. Then you have this road here. So obviously the road is going to be much more open than the woods. So the center of Jackson's column will bulge forward, while his right and left flank will lag behind as they try to contend with Mother Nature in these woods. Jackson's men will keep advancing down this road in this direction where you're seeing. He's going to head towards Chancellorsville. They're going to advance for about a half to 3/4 of a mile down this road, when they finally call a halt for the first two divisions that have been engaged. That is Robert Rhodes and Raleigh Colston's division. And then Jackson will bring up his third and final division that he has on hand, and that is the light division of A.P. Hill. There's nothing light about it. There's 12,000 Confederates in this division, and Hill is the only senior commander that Jackson has with him on this flank attack. So it's Jackson and his nemesis internally, A.P. Hill, who will be starting to now launch the second phase of the flank attack, which I'm going to throw over to Chris Mackowski to talk a little bit about probably the most famous action outside of the flank attack at Chancellorsville. And Chris, I'll bring up a map for you as you start to talk.
Sure. So Jackson, when he lines up, his line extends basically about 2 miles with the road at the center. As he advances, we've talked about how his line has collapsed because of the lack of cohesion, because of the different topographical features. And so he really has a front that's really only a few hundred yards by the time he finally bogs down. He's got two first-time division commanders, Robert Rhodes and Raleigh Colston, and they're exhausted. His men are confused. He's going to turn to A.P. Hill, a man he has a very rocky relationship with, but a man he also knows he can depend on rock solid in battle. And so he's going to really use Hill's oncoming division to try to pick up the momentum that he has lost and push forward. But he needs to figure out what exactly to have Hill do. So he's going to do a reconnaissance. Hill is also going to do a reconnaissance. And as the two commanders are trying to figure things out, Jackson's really got two different options. He continued to push along the turnpike, heading eastward toward the Chancellorsville mansion. He's only about a mile away from that intersection, but he suddenly sees an opportunity here at the Bullock Road on the map that you're looking at that heads off toward the northeast. He could strike out in that direction and try to cut the Federal Army off from its escape fords. And so as he's trying to get a sense of the lay of the land, he starts to think that rather than just push the army off the field, he has the chance to cut them off and utterly destroy them. That's the exact kind of battlefield victory that Robert E. is looking for. So as Jackson is trying to do his reconnaissance, the turnpike wide open, it's been the scene of fighting all day, not necessarily a safe and secure route for him to take, but he has someone on his staff who says, hey, look, we've got a guy who lives from this area. His name's David Kyle. His family lives just up the Bullock Road. This is literally Kyle's backyard. And so David Kyle, whom we fondly remember portrayal by our former colleague Richard Chapman at the Chancellorsville Visitor Center. I'll give him a little shout there. David Kyle leads Jackson and his staff down this road that doesn't show up on the maps. It's called the Mountain Road. And Jackson goes ahead of his main battle line, but not as far as his picket line. He stops, he listens, he can hear that the Federals are digging in, they're chopping down trees, they're fortifying their position, and he realizes that he's got to continue this attack as soon as possible. He can't allow the Federals to have all night to dig in. And so he's going to send Hill forward as another sledgehammer to try to keep pushing away the Federals, and he's going to try to make that drive to cut them off from the fords. So as he comes to that decision, he's going to turn around and head back to his line. And as he does so, Hill also out on reconnaissance at the same time. He doesn't have a David Kyle, so he's out in the middle of the open turnpike. He's going to head back at the same time. And then this is kind of where the fog of war sits over the battlefields, as I like to say. And we've got four North Carolina units there. You can see starting at the 7th North Carolina on the southern end of the line, they get spooked and they start firing at shadows. By this point, it's almost 9 p.m. There's a full moon casting all sorts of funny shadows through the thick forest, heavy gun smoke filling in the nooks and crannies. And so it's easy to get spooked out there. They hear weird noises. They've had Federal infantry bump into them. They've had Federal cavalry bump into them. So it's no wonder that they're skittish. And as they start firing, that ripple of fire extends northward along the line, jumping from the 7th to the 37th to the 18th, just as Jackson, in front of the 18th, has turned around to return to his line. And so he gets caught in that ripple of fire. His men, several of them get shot off their horses. One of them, his brother-in-law, Joseph Morrison, one of his aides, jumps to his feet, says, "Stop, you're firing into your own men." And that really lets the North Carolinians know that indeed there is someone. They're not just shooting at shadows. And they think it's a trick. And their commander, Major Barry, says, "It's a lie, pour it into them, boys." And the whole line erupts in a concentrated volley at that point. Jackson's hit 3 times. Hill, also returning at the same time along the parallel turnpike, is also hit. All the members of his staff are shot. Hill jumps into a ditch at the last moment. He starts to hear voices. He pushes his way through and he finds Jackson, who has been taken down off his horse, wounded. It's going to be up to Hill to take over this attack. He has not had the chance to confer with Jackson. He doesn't know what Jackson wants. He doesn't know that his job is going to be to try to cut the Federals off from the fords. So he's got to try to make sense of all this chaos at a moment of high crisis with his commander injured, the entire corps completely discombobulated, exhausted, confused. And at that time, the Federals are going to try to mix things up a little bit by raining artillery shells into the area. All this gunfire has attracted their attention. And so as the shells come raining in, one of them explodes and actually clips Hill with a fragment across the back of both of his legs. It's going to make him unable to ride his horse, and he can't assume command. We've got two other division commanders in the field who are extremely inexperienced. This is both of the first time at division command for Rhodes and for Colston. And so now there is this leadership crisis on this end of the field, even as Jackson's entire corps is isolated and unconnected from Lee's, and Hooker's army right in the middle, spoiling for a fight, wounded, surprised, scared, could easily turn and crush Lee or turn and crush Jackson. And so this is a pivotal moment for Lee's army. And he's going to end up turning to the one person on that whole side of the field who's got any sort of experience. And that's going to be Cavalry Commander Jeb Stuart, who's going to have to come in and try to make sense of this mess. And Chris, I know you and I have talked about this a lot. It is quite a situation for Stuart to try to step into.
Yeah, Stuart, and I'll throw it for Dan here too. Stuart's up to the north. He's in the Federal rear, essentially. He's laying in wait for one of his old West Point classmates, a guy named William Averill, who's was part of the Union Cav, who had supposedly been out on this large raid with George Stoneman. Averill shows up, dealing with high rivers and mud, and kind of, I wouldn't say gave it a half-hearted effort, but Averill's going to come back to the Union rear, endure the wrath of Joseph Hooker later on for doing so. But Jeb Stuart starts to spy these guys in the rear, and he lies in wait. And just about the time he's about to spring the trap on Averill's men, he gets this message that Stonewall Jackson is down, and that he is the man who's supposed to be in charge now of the Confederate 2nd Army Corps. This is the first time he's going to command infantry really since 1861. Stuart is going to tell those guys up around the river, laying in wait for Averill, fire a few rounds and withdraw, and Stuart rides himself down and arrives on the front about midnight to take over a very fluid situation where the Union Army, as you can see here on this map, has put itself into a salient position, but it is still very lethal, and they are between Robert E. Lee's forces of Anderson and McLaws on the right-hand side of the map and the rest of the Confederate Army on the left-hand side. If at any point Stuart's men flinch, they're probably going to endure the wrath of the 3rd, 5th, 1st Army Corps, 12th Army Corps. But Stuart, ever the aggressor, will try to straighten out his lines, and that will set off a battle on May 3rd, which we don't have a lot of time to talk about, which we won't. We'll jump over to Chancellorsville here. But Stuart's in a terrible position. Not only does Jackson's staff mostly ride off with him to the Wilderness Church, where Jackson's left arm is amputated around 2 o'clock in the morning on May the 3rd. Most of Jackson's staff, surprisingly, don't like Jeb Stuart, even though Jeb Stuart and Stonewall Jackson, for some odd reason, actually get along very well, which you would think opposites must attract in this case, because Jackson, who has absolutely no sense of humor and is a guy I'd never want to sit down and have a conversation with, and Stuart, the life of the party, you have two different people here, two different personalities, and it doesn't mesh at all with Jackson's staff officers. They're not pleased about it. But Stuart is going to make the best of a bad situation. Dan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, the night of May 2nd into the early morning hours of May 3rd is entirely about perception in the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. You have the most popular commander, Stonewall Jackson, who is struck down, a victim of friendly fire. He's taken off the field, and command devolves upon Robert Rhodes. Rhodes is a relative newcomer, and he knows that there's going to be an incredible blow to the morale of the men in the ranks when they hear that Jackson has been put out of action. So Rhodes very humbly steps aside and brings in Stuart, who is probably second to Jackson, the most visible and most popular commander in the Army. And it's going to be a major boost to the morale of the Confederate soldiers as they begin the fighting on May 3rd.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see here, as Dan mentioned, Rhodes steps aside. The next senior commander in the 2nd Corps would have been Jubal Early, who's actually 12 miles away dealing with his own problems at the Second Battle of Fredericksburg, which is about to kick up on the morning of May the 3rd. So Early is not there. A.P. Hill, who is supposed to have taken over, who is Jackson's second in command. Hill's wounded about 5 to 10 minutes after Jackson is by the timetable, most likely. Hill, I question how badly he is injured and how much he just doesn't want to assume command of this mess that Jackson has set him up with. And I say this because of a few letters that were exchanged between Jeb Stuart and A.B. Hill in November of 1862, and how little Hill cared to serve under Jackson, and how he felt that Hill would take all the blame for anything that happened poorly with Stonewall Jackson. And Jackson was always placed on a pedestal in Hill's mind. Fantastic set of letters written on November 18th of 1862. So I always question that just a little bit. How wounded was he? Because as soon as the battle's over, Stuart's back in the saddle and taking over. So that's something to consider there. But, this is a really tough situation to be in. And Robert E. Lee now has to put his army back together with an enraged Union Army of about 80,000 men between him and his 40 to 45,000 Confederates, one on east side of the salient, one on the west side. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to get into the May 3rd fighting. We'll do that in another time. But before we sign off, I want to take us over to the last slide that we want to show, and that will be Chancellorsville here. Chris, I know that you think that there's a lost opportunity, as do I, with the Union 1st and 5th Corps, who would be on Stuart/Jackson's left flank, off in those woods that you're seeing here at the Chancellorsville crossroads. In naval terms, they could essentially cross the T and come in behind General Stuart's flank and to his rear. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, and that last map actually showed it really well. If Jackson had pushed on toward U.S. forward, as he decided he wanted to do, he would have had the 1st and 5th Corps completely on his left flank. And so when people talk about, well, if Jackson hadn't gotten shot, that's the big factor I always try to remind people. He had 3 exhausted divisions that he was about to throw against 2 fresh Union Corps who are brand new. So the mathematics there aren't very good in Jackson's favor. Here we're at the 360 degree view at the Chancellorsville intersection, the most important intersection in the country, on May 1st, 2nd, and 3rd and 4th of 1863. The ruins of the Chancellorsville Mansion are right there in front of you. You can see the foundation was actually added on to on 3 separate occasions. It's going to serve as Hooker's headquarters during the battle. When the 11th Corps is routed off to the right in this photo, and the survivors of the 11th Corps come running pell-mell down the turnpike, Hooker's going to stand on the porch and watch them run by and wonder who those men are and why are they not in line. And that's going to be his first indication that something is seriously wrong on his right flank. You can see in this sketch that Chris has brought up for us, it's really the epicenter of the army. As the roads fan out from this direction, Hooker's got himself well organized. You can see fortifications built in front of us here. Those would be 2nd Corps fortifications. And if we're in that sketch extending off to the left, the 12th Corps is going to connect with them. It's really going to be Darius Couch, the second in command of the army, who's going to eventually salvage the situation. Henry Slocum, commander of the 12th Corps, also going to be very important in that. But you can see why Hooker thinks he is holding all the cards. He's got a great position. He's controlling the roads. He's got everything all lined up in front of him. Things look fantastic. We're going to let Bobby Lee come at me. And of course, Bobby Lee is going to come at him in the direction that he's not expecting. So as you have the chance to stand here in the middle of the intersection, some cool stuff to see, some artillery pieces. You can see a little bit about the foundation itself. You can learn about the plantation life. And of course, the war is going to throw all of that into tumult. The mansion is going to catch fire during the battle itself. In very dramatic fashion, a Union officer is going to evacuate these civilians who are hunkered down in the basement, the mansion burning down behind them. And really, it's into this intersection at about 10:30 in the morning on May 3rd, as Hooker's line collapses all around him. Robert E. Lee is going to come riding in at his triumphant moment, overcoming odds of more than 2-1 to score what a lot of historians have called Lee's greatest victory.
Yeah, and Hooker in the battle is going to be wounded. He'll be standing on the 2nd-story porch of the Chancellor home whenever an artillery shell comes crashing in, splits the pillar he's standing beside, splits it in 2, smashes him into the head, knocks him unconscious. And many people thought he was dead. The mansion's on fire. He's taken out the back door on a stretcher. Eventually, he's able to sit up and show that he is not dead. A cheer will go up from his soldiers. He'll be taken a little bit farther to the rear, where another shell almost kills him a few minutes later. So Hooker is concussed, knocked out of battle. And that is going to help to play to Robert E. Lee. Hooker, who doesn't have a lot of trust in anybody because he is untrustworthy himself, will be reluctant to allow any staff officers to take over, or even his second in command. One by one, the guns across the street, you can see an open area here just over top the speed limit sign. Those guns will go silent because doesn't have his chief of artillery on the field, Henry Hunt, to help organize the guns or replenish their ammunition. One by one, those guns go silent, and a gap opens in the trees over in this direction whenever Joseph Revere, the grandson of Paul Revere, will actually pull his brigade out of line against orders, and the Confederates will find it in a fortuitous bit of luck and come pouring through. Those will be Dorsey Pender's men and Edward Thomas's Georgians. As they come pouring into it, that will crack Hooker's salient here, and eventually a fighting retreat headed by Winfield Scott Hancock and John White Gary will pull the Union Army back to a position to the north. But the fighting on May the 3rd is ferocious. May 2nd set up May the 3rd. In the 5 hours of fighting between 5 a.m. May the 3rd to 10 a.m. May the 3rd, there are 17,000 casualties, and that's one man every second over those 5 hours that will fall as a casualty. And out to the east, down at Fredericksburg, another engagement will come to life known as the Second Battle of Fredericksburg, and then the Battle of Salem Church, which the Union 6th Army Corps, as Hooker's ace up its sleeve, will try to come in and save Hooker's bacon from literally the fire here at Chancellorsville, but it will be all for naught. And with that, the Chancellorsville campaign will essentially end with Hooker pulling back, the Union Army having a chip on its shoulder, feeling that they were not defeated here, and surprised that Hooker gave up the initiative and gave up the battle, which will lead to Lee taking the initiative, marching north towards Gettysburg, and bringing on the Gettysburg campaign, where the Union Army will finally get that victory that it had sought here at Chancellorsville and came close to actually winning at times. But it will take another few months, 2 months, in fact, before they have that victory on northern soil at Gettysburg. Dan, Chris, I want to thank you for joining us today. I want to thank the members of the American Battlefield Trust for being a part of this preservation effort here at Chancellorsville. Head over to battlefields.org. Check out all of our virtual tour maps that we have here that we've gone through. We have our maps that Steve Stanley has put together. We have galleries of photographs of Chancellorsville, videos featuring former chief historian at the battlefield, Robert Crick. We have all kinds of great content, all free at battlefields.org. Chris, Dan, thank you for joining, and thank all of you for watching and supporting Battlefield Preservation.